My name is Amber Hayes, and I'm 26 years old. I thought Christmas morning would bring my family together, but instead, it shattered everything I believed about the people I loved. I had spent 3 months hand-stitching a beautiful quilt from our late grandmother's fabric, pouring my heart into every stitch for my sister Crystal. When I proudly presented it to her in front of our entire family, she took one look at my gift, threw it directly into the trash can, and declared, "This is filthy. How dare you bring this garbage into my home?" The room fell silent as 30 relatives stared at me in shock. But what happened next would change our family forever. Before we dive into this incredible story of betrayal and revenge, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button if you're ready for some serious family drama, and don't forget to subscribe, because this tale is going to take you on an emotional rollercoaster you won't believe. Trust me, what my sister did next was even worse than throwing away my gift, and how I got my revenge will leave you speechless. Let's get started. To understand the magnitude of what happened that Christmas morning, you need to know about the foundation of resentment that Crystal had been building for years. Growing up, Crystal was always the golden child in our family. While I worked multiple jobs to put myself through community college, she was pampered and spoiled by our parents, Harold and Beverly Hayes. Crystal married her wealthy husband Bradford Wellington when she was just 21, moving into his massive estate on the outskirts of town. Meanwhile, I was raising my 7-year-old daughter Ruby as a single mother, working as a medical assistant at a local clinic and struggling to make ends meet. Our grandmother, Margaret Hayes, had passed away 6 months earlier, leaving behind boxes of beautiful vintage fabrics she had collected over decades. When I found them in her attic, I was overwhelmed with memories of sitting beside her as a child, watching her create the most incredible quilts with her weathered hands. The fabrics told stories of different eras, some from the 1940s with delicate floral patterns, others from the 60s with bold geometric designs. I knew immediately what I wanted to do with them. For 3 months, I worked every evening after Ruby went to bed, carefully cutting and piecing together a queen-sized quilt that would honor our grandmother's memory. Each square represented a different period of her life, and I researched the historical significance of every pattern. I hand-stitched each seam, refusing to use my sewing machine, because I wanted the quilt to have the same love and attention that Grandma Margaret put into her work. My fingers were constantly pricked with needle marks, and I often stayed up until 2 in the morning perfecting each detail. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was creating this masterpiece while living paycheck to paycheck. Crystal had everything money could buy, but I was giving her something that couldn't be purchased, a piece of our family history infused with months of love and dedication. I genuinely believed that this gift would help rebuild the bridge between us that had been slowly crumbling since her marriage to Bradford. What I didn't know at the time was that Crystal's perfect life was falling apart behind closed doors. Bradford's real estate development company was secretly hemorrhaging money due to his gambling addiction and poor business decisions. Their marriage was on rocky ground, with Bradford staying out late and Crystal discovering suspicious charges on their credit cards. She was facing the possibility of losing everything she had built her identity around: her status, her wealth, her position in society. But instead of reaching out to family for support, Crystal had chosen a different path. She had been systematically poisoning our parents against me for months, planting seeds of doubt about my parenting abilities and financial responsibility. She would call them regularly with fabricated stories about my struggles, always positioning herself as the concerned sister who was worried about poor Ruby growing up in such unstable conditions. Every family gathering, she would make subtle comments about my second-hand clothes or my beat-up car, always delivered with a sweet smile that made her cruelty seem like concern. Our parents, now in their 70s and becoming increasingly dependent on Crystal's financial support, began to view me through her distorted lens. They started making comments about how I should be more like my sister, how I should find a husband to provide stability for Ruby, how I was selfish for not accepting Crystal's offers to help me get my life together. What they didn't understand was that Crystal's help always came with strings attached, strings that would bind me to her control and make me dependent on her charity. The Christmas morning assault on my gift was just the beginning of Crystal's calculated attack. As I stood there in shock, watching my months of work lying crumpled in her pristine white kitchen trash can, the room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Our parents, Harold and Beverly, immediately rushed to Crystal's defense without even asking for my side of the story. "Amber, honey, you know Crystal has allergies to certain fabrics," my mother said, her voice dripping with the kind of patronizing tone she had perfected over the years. "You really should have asked before bringing something like that into her home." My father nodded in agreement, adding, "Your sister has worked hard to create a beautiful environment for her family. You need to be more considerate." Crystal's performance was Academy Award worthy. She pressed her perfectly manicured hand to her chest and sighed dramatically. "I'm so sorry, Amber. I know you meant well, but that quilt smells like poverty and old houses. I simply can't have something like that in my home where my children might be exposed to who knows what kind of germs or mites. It's just not sanitary." Her voice was sugar-sweet, but her eyes held a coldness that made my blood run cold. Bradford Wellington, her husband, decided to pile on with his own brand of condescension. "Maybe next time you could save up for something from a proper store, Amber. I know money is tight for you, but there are layaway programs at decent department stores. We just can't accept handmade items anymore, it's a liability issue with our insurance." His voice carried the entitled arrogance of someone who had never worked a day for anything in his life. The most devastating part was watching my daughter Ruby witness this entire exchange. She had been so excited about the quilt, helping me pick out some of the fabric combinations and listening to stories about her great-grandmother while I worked. Now she was watching 30 family members either actively participate in humiliating her mother or stand by in uncomfortable silence. Tears started streaming down her face as she tugged on my sweater, asking why everyone was being mean to me. Crystal's cousin Veronica Sterling, another wealthy socialite, who lived in the same exclusive neighborhood, seized the opportunity to add her own venom to the attack. "You know, Amber, I think what Crystal is trying to say is that handmade gifts are really more appropriate between certain social circles. When you're dealing with people who have invested in quality furnishings and maintain certain standards, homemade items can actually be offensive. It suggests that you think their taste isn't sophisticated enough for proper gifts." The cruelty of that moment was breathtaking. Here I was, surrounded by people who were supposed to love and support me, being attacked for creating something beautiful with my own hands. The quilt represented everything good about our family's history, our grandmother's creativity, the value of hard work, the importance of preserving family traditions. But Crystal had managed to twist it into something shameful, something that represented my failures rather than my love. As the attacks continued, I realized that this wasn't really about the quilt at all. This was about Crystal's need to maintain her position as the family's success story by ensuring that I remained the cautionary tale. Every kind gesture I made toward her was a threat to the narrative she had carefully constructed, where she was the responsible sister, and I was the struggling single mother who couldn't get her life together. The final blow came when Crystal announced that she thought it would be best if Ruby and I left early, before we caused any more disruption to the family celebration. My own parents didn't object to this banishment. Instead, they hugged Crystal and assured her that she had handled the situation with grace and maturity. As I gathered my coat and Ruby's things, I heard my mother telling other relatives that she was worried about my mental health and my ability to make appropriate decisions. Walking out of that house with my crying daughter, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and humiliation were transforming into something else entirely, a cold, calculating anger that I had never experienced before. Crystal had declared war on me in front of our entire family, and she had gotten everyone else to participate in my destruction. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated just how strong I could become when someone threatened my daughter's happiness. The drive home from Crystal's house was silent except for Ruby's quiet sniffling in the backseat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white as I replayed every moment of the humiliation we had just endured. But instead of wallowing in self-pity, something fierce and determined was awakening inside me. I needed to understand exactly what Crystal had been doing behind the scenes to turn our entire family against me. The next morning, I called my Aunt Judith Morrison, my father's younger sister, who had always been the black sheep of the family for her unconventional lifestyle and outspoken personality. Judith lived in a small apartment across town and worked as a freelance journalist, which meant she had both the skills and the motivation to help me uncover the truth about what was really happening in our family dynamics. "I've been waiting for this call for months," Judith said when I explained what had happened at Christmas. "Your sister has been running a masterful campaign to isolate you, sweetie. She's been calling your parents weekly with stories about how worried she is about you and Ruby. According to Crystal's version of reality, you're barely keeping your head above water financially, you're not feeding Ruby properly, and you're too proud to accept help from family." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "What kind of stories?" I asked, dreading the answer. Judith's voice became gentle but firm. "She told your parents that Ruby came to her house wearing clothes with holes in them, claiming you couldn't afford to buy her proper winter gear. She said she's offered multiple times to take Ruby shopping for school clothes, but you refused to let her help out of stubbornness. She even suggested that you might have a drinking problem, because you seemed unstable and emotional the last few times she saw you." Each revelation felt like another piece of a puzzle clicking into place. I had wondered why my parents had become increasingly critical of my parenting choices over the past year, why they questioned every decision I made about Ruby's care, why they looked at me with such concern and disappointment during family gatherings. Crystal had been systematically destroying my reputation while positioning herself as the caring sister who was desperately trying to save her niece from an unfit mother. But Judith had more shocking information to share. "There's something else you need to know, Amber. Your grandmother's will contain specific instructions about her fabric collection. She left detailed notes about which granddaughter should inherit what, and those fabrics were specifically meant for the granddaughter who honors family traditions through hard work and dedication. That was clearly meant for you, not Crystal." My blood ran cold as I processed this information. "Are you saying Crystal knew about Grandma's intentions?" "I'm saying Crystal has been intercepting mail from your grandmother's attorney for months. There are letters that were supposed to be delivered to you about inheritance items, family recipes, even some of your grandmother's jewelry. Crystal has been collecting everything and deciding what you should and shouldn't receive based on her own judgment." The scope of my sister's betrayal was becoming clear, and it was far worse than I had imagined. She hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she had stolen my connection to our grandmother's memory. Those fabrics weren't just valuable materials, they were intended as a message from beyond the grave, an acknowledgement of my character and my commitment to family values. Judith continued her revelations. "I've also heard through my sources that Crystal's marriage is in serious trouble. Bradford has been having an affair with his secretary for over a year, and there are rumors about financial problems with his business. Crystal is facing the possibility of divorce and potentially losing her lifestyle, which explains why she's been so desperate to maintain control over the family narrative and resources. This new information changed everything about how I viewed Crystal's recent behavior. Her attacks on me weren't just coming from a place of sibling rivalry or jealousy, they were coming from a place of desperation. She was fighting to preserve her position as the family's golden child, because she knew that if her perfect life fell apart, she would need somewhere to land. By destroying my credibility and relationships within the family, she was ensuring that when she needed help, she would be the sympathetic victim rather than the sister, who had always been irresponsible. As I hung up the phone with Judith, I felt a clarity that I hadn't experienced in months. Crystal's Christmas attack hadn't been a spontaneous reaction to an unwelcome gift. It had been a calculated move in a much larger game that she had been playing without my knowledge. She had been setting me up for public humiliation for months, building a foundation of lies that would make my family automatically take her side when she finally struck. But now I knew the truth, and knowledge was power. Crystal had been fighting a war against me while I remained blissfully unaware that we were even in battle. That was about to change. I was going to fight back, but I was going to be smarter, more strategic, and more thorough than she had ever imagined possible. The war Crystal had started was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 days after the Christmas incident, I was at work when my supervisor, Dr. Melissa Rodriguez, called me into her office with a concerned expression on her face. My stomach immediately dropped, because Dr. Rodriguez had been nothing but supportive during my 2 years at the clinic, and seeing her look worried made me fear the worst. "Amber, I need to ask you about some allegations that were brought to my attention yesterday," she began, her voice professional but kind. "Someone called the clinic claiming to be a concerned family member, reporting that you've been struggling with substance abuse, and that your work performance might be compromised. They suggested that we should be monitoring you more closely and possibly consider requiring drug testing." The blood drained from my face as I realized what was happening. "Dr. Rodriguez, I can promise you that I have never used drugs or alcohol inappropriately. My work has always been my priority, especially because I need this job to support my daughter." "Who made this call?" The caller identified herself as your sister and said she was worried about patient safety. She mentioned several specific incidents where you allegedly showed up to work disoriented or smelling like alcohol. She also claimed that you've been taking medication from the clinic's sample closet for personal use. Every single allegation was a complete fabrication, but Crystal had done her homework. She knew enough about my workplace to make the accusations sound plausible, and she had positioned herself as a concerned family member rather than someone with malicious intent. The beauty of her strategy was that even if the accusations were proven false, the mere fact that they had been made would cast doubt on my character and professionalism. Dr. Rodriguez continued, "I want you to know that I don't believe these allegations for a second. Your work has been exemplary, and I've never observed any behavior that would suggest substance abuse. However, I am required by hospital policy to document this complaint and investigate it thoroughly. I'm going to need you to submit to a drug test today, and I'll be reviewing your access logs for the medication storage areas." The humiliation of having to prove my innocence for crimes I hadn't committed was overwhelming, but it was nothing compared to what happened when I got home that evening. A car from Child Protective Services was parked in my driveway, and a social worker named Janet Phillips was waiting to speak with me about a report of potential child neglect. "Ms. Hayes, we received a detailed complaint alleging that your daughter Ruby is being raised in unsafe conditions." The caller provided specific examples of times when Ruby appeared malnourished, inadequately clothed for weather conditions, and emotionally distressed due to instability in the home environment. Ruby was at her after-school program, which meant she wouldn't witness this humiliating inspection, but the terror of potentially losing my daughter made my entire body shake with rage and fear. The social worker spent 2 hours going through my home with a fine-tooth comb, photographing Ruby's bedroom, examining the contents of our refrigerator, and asking probing questions about my parenting practices and financial stability. The person who made the report seemed very knowledgeable about your family situation, Janet Phillips noted as she reviewed her paperwork. She mentioned that you've been struggling financially to the point where Ruby sometimes goes to school without lunch money, and that you've been relying on her aunt for financial assistance, but have been too proud to accept adequate help. Once again, Crystal's lies contained just enough truth to be believable. I had been struggling financially, most single mothers do, but I had never let Ruby go without meals or appropriate clothing. The few times Crystal had offered to buy Ruby clothes or toys, I had politely declined, because I preferred to provide for my daughter myself. Crystal had twisted my independence into evidence of neglect, and my pride into proof of endangering my child. The inspection ultimately revealed no evidence of abuse or neglect, but the social worker informed me that my case would remain open for 6 months with periodic check-ins to ensure Ruby's continued well-being. Having CPS involvement on my record would potentially affect any future custody disputes, employment background checks, or housing applications. Crystal had found a way to create a permanent stain on my reputation that would follow me for years. But the final blow in Crystal's second wave of attacks came when I discovered that she had also contacted my ex-husband Derek, Ruby's father, who had been largely absent from our lives for the past 3 years. Derek lived in another state and rarely paid his court-ordered child support, but Crystal had somehow tracked him down and filled his head with stories about my incompetence as a mother. Derek called me that evening, his voice full of fake concern and barely contained excitement. "Amber, I've been hearing some troubling things about how Ruby is being raised. Maybe it's time we reconsider our custody arrangement. I've got a stable job now and a house with a yard. Ruby might be better off with me until you get your life straightened out." The audacity of this suggestion was breathtaking. Derek, who had abandoned his responsibilities as a father and contributed virtually nothing to Ruby's upbringing, was now positioning himself as her potential savior based on lies that Crystal had fed him. I realized that Crystal wasn't just attacking me individually. She was building a coalition of people who would support her narrative and potentially take Ruby away from me entirely. As I hung up the phone, I understood that Crystal's strategy was becoming clear. She was systematically destroying every aspect of my life, my job, my reputation as a mother, my relationship with my daughter's father, and my standing in the community. She was creating a perfect storm that would leave me with no options except to accept her version of reality and submit to her control. But Crystal had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that her attacks would break me, that I would crumble under the pressure and beg her for forgiveness and help. Instead, her escalation had awakened something fierce and strategic in me that I didn't know existed. I was no longer the naive sister who believed in family loyalty and forgiveness. I was a mother fighting for her child, and there was no limit to what I would do to protect Ruby and expose the truth about Crystal's manipulation. The morning after Derek's threatening phone call, I was sitting on my front porch with my coffee, trying to process everything that had happened over the past week, when my neighbor Garrett Thompson approached me with a concerned expression. Garrett was a retired police detective in his early 60s, who had moved to our neighborhood 2 years earlier, after his wife passed away. We had developed a friendly relationship over time, with him occasionally helping me with small home repairs and me bringing him homemade meals when I noticed his lights on late at night. "Amber, I hope you don't mind me asking, but I noticed some unusual activity around your house lately. Child services, people taking photographs from the street, phone calls that seem to upset you. Is everything all right?" His voice carried the professional tone of someone trained to investigate problems, but also the genuine concern of a friend. I found myself pouring out the entire story to Garrett: Crystal's Christmas attack, the lies she had been spreading, the CPS investigation, the threats to my job, Derek's sudden interest in custody. As I spoke, I watched Garrett's expression shift from surprise to anger to something that looked like professional determination. Amber, what you're describing sounds like a systematic harassment campaign designed to destroy your credibility and isolate you from support systems. In my 30 years in law enforcement, I've seen this pattern before, usually in domestic abuse cases, where one person is trying to gain complete control over another person's life. Garrett's validation of my experiences was the first real support I had received since this nightmare began. The good news is that people who engage in this kind of behavior usually leave evidence trails. They get overconfident and make mistakes. Would you be willing to let me do some investigating on your behalf? Within 24 hours, Garrett had already uncovered several inconsistencies in Crystal's stories. He had contacted the school to verify whether Ruby had ever come to class inappropriately dressed or without lunch, spoke with my previous employers to confirm my work history and character references, and even checked public records for any documentation of the financial struggles Crystal had claimed I was experiencing. Your sister has been very busy spreading lies, but she hasn't been careful about making sure those lies could withstand scrutiny, Garrett reported. Ruby's teacher has nothing but positive things to say about both of you. Your work history shows consistent employment and excellent references. There's no evidence anywhere of the problems Crystal has been claiming exist. But the real breakthrough came when Garrett suggested we contact Louise Chen, an attorney who had handled our grandmother's estate. Louise had known our family for decades, and had been particularly fond of our grandmother's commitment to preserving family history and traditions. I've been hoping someone would contact me about Margaret's fabric collection, Louise said when we met in her office. Your grandmother left very specific instructions about how her possessions should be distributed, and there have been some irregularities in how her wishes have been carried out. Louise pulled out a thick file containing our grandmother's will, handwritten letters, and detailed inventories of her possessions. Margaret was very clear that her fabric collection, sewing equipment, and family recipes should go to the granddaughter, who honors family traditions through hard work and creativity. She specifically mentioned watching you sew as a child and being impressed by your dedication to learning traditional techniques. The documentation was overwhelming. Our grandmother had not only intended for me to inherit the fabrics I had used for the quilt, but she had also left detailed instructions about other family heirlooms that Crystal had claimed for herself. There were photographs of specific quilts that Margaret wanted preserved, recipes written in her handwriting that she wanted passed down, and even jewelry that held special significance to our family's history. Crystal presented herself as the primary contact for estate matters, and has been receiving all correspondence about your grandmother's wishes. She told me that you weren't interested in most of the family items, because you didn't have space for them and preferred that she handle the distribution. Louise continued, but there's something else you need to know. Your grandmother included a sealed letter specifically for you that was supposed to be delivered after her funeral. Crystal claimed she would pass it along, but based on what you're telling me about recent events, I suspect that never happened. The letter, written in our grandmother's shaky, but determined handwriting, brought tears to my eyes as I read it. She had recognized the challenges I was facing as a single mother, and wanted me to know how proud she was of my strength and independence. She specifically mentioned the fabric collection, and expressed her hope that I would continue the family tradition of creating beautiful things with my own hands. My dear Amber, the letter read, you remind me so much of myself at your age, determined to build something meaningful despite obstacles that others couldn't understand. The fabrics I'm leaving you have stories to tell, and I trust you to honor those stories while creating new ones. Don't let anyone convince you that handmade gifts aren't valuable. The most precious things in life come from love and effort, not from stores. Reading those words from beyond the grave, I realized that Crystal's attack on my quilt hadn't just been an attack on my gift, it had been an attack on everything our grandmother valued and everything she had hoped I would represent in our family. Louise offered to help me reclaim my rightful inheritance and document Crystal's interference with the estate distribution. Garrett volunteered to help gather evidence of Crystal's harassment campaign and potentially pursue legal action for defamation and false reporting to authorities. For the first time since Christmas morning, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. But more importantly, I was beginning to understand that Crystal's desperation went far beyond simple sibling rivalry. She had been systematically stealing pieces of my identity, my family connections, and my daughter's security, because she needed to rebuild herself after her own life fell apart. The question was no longer whether I would fight back, the question was how thoroughly I was prepared to expose the truth about who Crystal really was. Just when I thought Crystal couldn't escalate her campaign against me any further, she launched her most devastating attack yet. 2 weeks after my meeting with Louise Chen, I received official legal papers that made my blood run cold. Derek, my ex-husband, was filing for emergency custody of Ruby, claiming that I had become an unfit mother due to financial instability, substance abuse allegations, and ongoing investigation by Child Protective Services. The petition was professionally prepared and included detailed supporting documentation that could have only come from someone with intimate knowledge of the recent attacks on my character. Derek's attorney had copies of the CPS report, documentation of the workplace allegations Crystal had made, and even photographs that had supposedly been taken of my home during times when it was in disarray. But the most shocking element of the custody filing was the inclusion of Bradford Wellington as a character witness for Derek's case. Crystal's husband, whom I had barely spoken to in years, was submitting a sworn affidavit claiming that he had personally observed my erratic behavior and poor parenting decisions during family gatherings. He described incidents that had supposedly occurred at their home where I had appeared intoxicated and had been unable to properly supervise Ruby. Reading Bradford's statement felt like being punched in the stomach. Every single incident he described was a complete fabrication, but they were detailed enough to sound credible to someone who didn't know the truth. He claimed that during a family barbecue last summer, I had fallen asleep on their couch while Ruby played unsupervised near their swimming pool. He alleged that I had asked him for money multiple times, claiming I couldn't afford Ruby's school supplies or medical expenses. The strategy was diabolical in its effectiveness. Crystal and Bradford had created a paper trail of my alleged unfitness that spanned months, making it appear that multiple people had been documenting concerning behavior over time. They had turned Derek from an absent father into Ruby's potential savior, and they had positioned themselves as reluctant witnesses, who were only speaking up out of concern for a child's welfare. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, which gave me almost no time to prepare a defense. Derek's attorney was arguing that Ruby was in immediate danger and needed to be removed from my care pending a full custody evaluation. The thought of losing my daughter, even temporarily, made me physically ill. Crystal's manipulation reached new levels when Veronica Sterling submitted her own affidavit supporting Derek's custody petition. Veronica claimed that she had witnessed me struggling with anger management issues during family gatherings and had observed Ruby appearing fearful and withdrawn in my presence. She described conversations where I had allegedly made concerning statements about feeling overwhelmed by single parenthood and wishing I could escape my responsibilities. None of these conversations had ever taken place, but Veronica's social status and reputation for community involvement gave her statements significant credibility. She was known for her charity work and had served on several boards of directors for children's organizations, which made her appear to be a reliable witness who was only concerned about Ruby's well-being. The most devastating part of this attack was watching Ruby become increasingly anxious and confused as the legal proceedings unfolded. She knew something serious was happening but couldn't understand why suddenly her father, who had been largely absent from her life, was claiming he wanted to take care of her. She began having nightmares and asking me questions I couldn't answer honestly without terrifying her further. "Mommy, did I do something wrong?" she asked one evening as I was tucking her into bed. "Why is everyone saying bad things about you? Are you going to go away like Daddy did?" The custody battle was forcing me to consider possibilities I had never imagined. Derek's attorney was painting a picture of a struggling single mother who was too proud to accept help and too unstable to provide adequate care for her child. Crystal and Bradford were positioning themselves as the extended family members who had tried repeatedly to offer support, but had been rejected due to my stubbornness and pride. Even worse, Crystal had somehow convinced our parents that Derek's custody petition was legitimate and necessary. They weren't actively supporting Derek's case, but they weren't defending me either. Instead, they were making statements about being concerned about Amber's stress levels and thinking that maybe Ruby would benefit from more stability. The message was clear. Crystal had successfully isolated me from every support system I had ever relied upon. She had turned my ex-husband into an adversary, my parents into neutral parties who questioned my competence, and our extended family into witnesses for the prosecution. She had created a scenario where fighting for my own daughter made me appear selfish and defensive rather than protective and loving. But as I sat in my lawyer's office reviewing the custody petition for the 10th time, I realized that Crystal had finally made a crucial mistake. Her attacks had become so elaborate and involved so many people that she had created multiple opportunities for her lies to be exposed. Bradford's affidavit contained specific details that could be verified or disproven. Veronica's statements included conversations that had supposedly taken place in front of other witnesses who could contradict her claims. Most importantly, Crystal's decision to involve Derek revealed the true scope of her manipulation. She had managed to locate and coordinate with an ex-husband who lived in another state, convince him to file for custody of a daughter he barely knew, and provide him with detailed ammunition to use against me in court. This level of orchestration went far beyond the actions of a concerned sister. It was the work of someone who was desperate and dangerous. The custody hearing was going to be the ultimate test of whether truth could triumph over a carefully constructed campaign of lies. But now I had allies, evidence, and most importantly, a clear understanding of just how far Crystal was willing to go to destroy my life. The question was whether I was prepared to go just as far to protect my daughter and expose the truth about my sister's betrayal. The weekend before the emergency custody hearing, Garrett Thompson arrived at my house with a manila folder thick with documents and a grim expression that immediately told me he had uncovered something significant. Louise Chen was with him, her professional demeanor barely concealing what appeared to be righteous anger on my behalf. "Amber, we need to talk," Garrett began, settling into my kitchen chair with the weight of someone carrying explosive information. "I've been doing some deep background investigation into Crystal and Bradford's finances, and what I found is going to change everything about this custody battle." Louise opened her briefcase and spread several official-looking documents across my kitchen table. "Bradford Wellington is in serious legal trouble that goes far beyond marital problems. We've discovered evidence that he's been embezzling money from his own real estate development company for over 18 months to cover gambling debts and maintain his lifestyle despite declining business revenues." The documentation was overwhelming. Bank records showed large cash withdrawals that coincided with Bradford's trips to Atlantic City casinos. There were invoices for construction projects that had been paid but never completed, with the money apparently redirected to Bradford's personal accounts. Most damning of all, there were emails between Bradford and his business partner discussing the need to restructure finances before their annual audit revealed discrepancies. Garrett continued his revelations. But Bradford's financial crimes are just the tip of the iceberg. Crystal has been systematically stealing from your parents' household account that they set up to pay for their medications and medical expenses. She has power of attorney for their healthcare decisions, and she's been using that access to withdraw money for her own use. The evidence included bank statements showing regular transfers from Harold and Beverly's medical account to an account controlled by Crystal. There were receipts for luxury purchases made on the same days that money was withdrawn from the medical fund. Most disturbing of all, there were pharmacy records showing that my parents had been skipping doses of their prescription medications because they believed they couldn't afford to refill them regularly. Louise pointed to another set of documents. We also discovered that Crystal has been forging your parents' signatures on financial documents to access their savings accounts. She's taken over $60,000 from them in the past year alone, all while presenting herself as their devoted daughter, who was helping them manage their money. But the most shocking revelation came when Garrett handed me a small digital recording device. I took the liberty of recording a conversation I had with Veronica Sterling yesterday. She was more than willing to talk when I approached her as a concerned neighbor who was worried about the family situation. As I listened to the recording, my hands began to shake with rage. Veronica's voice was clear as she explained to Garrett how Crystal had approached her months ago with a plan to help Amber get her life together by creating a crisis that would force me to accept their help and guidance. Crystal was so convincing, Veronica said on the recording. She explained that Amber was too proud to accept assistance directly, so we needed to create circumstances that would make her realize she couldn't handle everything on her own. Crystal said it was like an intervention for someone with addiction problems. Sometimes you have to let them hit rock bottom before they'll accept help. Veronica went on to describe how Crystal had provided her with specific stories to tell about my behavior, and had coached her on how to make the allegations sound credible. She admitted that she had never actually witnessed most of the incidents she had described in her affidavit, but that Crystal had convinced her these interventions were necessary to save Ruby from an increasingly unstable home environment. Dr. Rodriguez had also provided crucial evidence for my defense. The clinic's security cameras had recorded timestamps showing that I had never exhibited any signs of intoxication or inappropriate behavior at work. The medication inventory logs proved that nothing had ever been missing from the sample closet, and my access card records showed that I had never entered the medication storage areas outside of normal work hours. Most importantly, Dr. Rodriguez had discovered that the person who had called the clinic claiming to be my concerned sister had actually called from a number registered to Bradford Wellington's business office. The call had been made during business hours on a day when Crystal was supposed to be at a charity luncheon across town, suggesting that the harassment campaign had been coordinated between Crystal and Bradford as a team effort. Louise had also uncovered evidence of Crystal's interference with our grandmother's estate that went far beyond simply intercepting letters. Crystal had actually forged my signature on documents declining several inheritance items that were rightfully mine, including a valuable antique sewing machine and a collection of family photographs that documented 4 generations of family history. The most disturbing discovery, Louise continued, is that Crystal has been systematically erasing your connection to your family's history. She's taken possession of items that were specifically meant for you, and has been presenting herself as the only granddaughter interested in preserving family traditions. But the evidence that would prove most crucial in the custody battle came from an unexpected source. Ruby's school had been documenting her academic and emotional progress throughout the year, and their records painted a picture of a happy, well-adjusted child who was thriving in a stable home environment. Her teachers noted her creativity, her pride in talking about her mother's work, and her excitement about family projects like helping with the quilt. The school counselor had also documented a concerning conversation with Ruby that had occurred just days after the Christmas incident. Ruby had asked to speak with her because she was confused about why family members were saying mean things about her mother when she knew that her mother was the best mom ever. The counselor's notes included direct quotes from Ruby describing how proud she was of our home, how she felt safe and loved, and how she didn't understand why people were lying about their family. As I reviewed all the evidence that Garrett and Louise had assembled, I realized that Crystal's campaign against me had been far more extensive and malicious than I had ever imagined. She hadn't just been trying to humiliate me or undermine my confidence. She had been systematically working to destroy every aspect of my life, while stealing from our elderly parents and positioning herself to benefit from my destruction. The custody hearing was no longer just about whether Derek could take Ruby away from me. It had become an opportunity to expose Crystal's criminal behavior, protect my parents from further financial abuse, and potentially send both Crystal and Bradford to prison for their crimes. The question was no longer whether I could defend myself against false allegations. The question was how thoroughly I was prepared to destroy the people who had tried to destroy my family. The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for Tuesday morning, but I decided that waiting for a courtroom confrontation would give Crystal too much time to cover her tracks or create new lies. Instead, Louise Chen and I agreed that the most effective strategy would be to present all of our evidence to the entire family simultaneously, forcing Crystal to respond to the truth in front of everyone who had participated in or witnessed her campaign against me. The perfect opportunity came when our father Harold announced that he was planning a birthday celebration for the following Saturday. Normally, I would have been hesitant to attend another family gathering after the Christmas disaster, but this time I was counting on Crystal's confidence and arrogance to ensure that she would be there, surrounded by all the people she had manipulated into supporting her narrative. I coordinated with Garrett and Louise to arrive at the party with comprehensive documentation of every lie Crystal had told, every crime Bradford had committed, and every piece of evidence that would expose the systematic campaign they had waged against my family. We prepared multiple copies of bank records, recorded conversations, legal documents, and photographic evidence that would make it impossible for anyone to dismiss our revelations as misunderstandings or exaggerations. When we walked into my parents' living room that Saturday afternoon, the atmosphere was exactly what I had expected. Crystal was holding court in the center of the room, describing to a group of relatives how concerned she was about the custody battle and how difficult it was to watch her sister spiral out of control. Bradford was positioned near the refreshment table, playing the role of the supportive brother-in-law, who was reluctantly involved in family drama. Veronica Sterling was also present, adding her own commentary about how sometimes interventions were necessary to protect children from parents who couldn't acknowledge their own limitations. The irony of listening to these three criminals discuss my fitness as a mother while planning to expose their crimes was almost overwhelming. I waited until the room was full and everyone was settled before approaching the center of the gathering. I need everyone's attention, because there are some things about recent family events that you all deserve to know, I announced, my voice carrying the calm authority of someone who held all the cards. Crystal's face immediately shifted from confident superiority to alert concern. Amber, I really don't think this is the time or place for whatever drama you're planning to create. We're here to celebrate Dad's birthday, not relitigate old family disagreements. Louise stepped forward with her briefcase full of documents. Actually, this is exactly the right time and place to discuss how Crystal Wellington and Bradford Wellington have been systematically defrauding this family while conducting a harassment campaign designed to destroy Amber's reputation and relationship with her daughter. The room fell silent as Louise began laying out the evidence on my father's coffee table. Bank records, showing Crystal's theft from my parents' medical account. Email correspondence proving Bradford's embezzlement from his own company. Recorded conversations revealing the coordinated lies that Veronica had told about my character and behavior. Bradford's face went pale as he realized the scope of what we had uncovered. Now wait a minute. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. These documents don't necessarily prove anything criminal. Garrett stepped forward with his own folder of evidence. Actually, Bradford, these documents prove multiple felonies including embezzlement, elder abuse, filing false reports to government agencies, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The FBI Financial Crimes Division is already reviewing your business records, based on information we provided to them yesterday. The revelation that federal authorities were involved sent shock waves through the room. Several relatives began demanding explanations, while others started examining the documents that Louise was distributing. Crystal's composure finally cracked, as she realized that her carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. "This is ridiculous," Crystal protested, her voice rising to a pitch that revealed her desperation. "Amber is obviously trying to deflect attention from her own problems by making wild accusations against people who have only tried to help her. These documents could be fabricated or taken out of context. But the evidence was too overwhelming and too detailed to be dismissed as fabrications." The bank records included Crystal's own signature on withdrawal slips. The recorded conversations included Veronica's voice clearly explaining how Crystal had coached her to lie about my behavior. The business documents included Bradford's own emails discussing his financial crimes. My parents' reactions were devastating to witness, but necessary for their own protection. My mother Beverly began crying as she realized that the daughter she had trusted with power of attorney had been stealing money intended for their essential medications. My father Harold's face turned red with anger as he processed the scope of Crystal's betrayal and manipulation. "Crystal, is this true?" my mother asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Have you been taking money from our medical account? Have we been skipping medications because you were stealing from us?" Crystal's attempt to maintain her innocence became increasingly frantic as more evidence was presented. When Louise played the recording of Veronica describing their conspiracy, several family members gasped audibly. When Garrett showed photographs of Bradford entering casinos on dates, when he was supposed to be working, Bradford himself stopped trying to deny the allegations. Veronica Sterling's confession was perhaps the most damning moment of the entire confrontation. Faced with evidence of her recorded statements and the potential legal consequences of filing false affidavits in a custody case, she broke down completely and admitted her role in Crystal's scheme. "I thought I was helping," she sobbed, addressing the room full of shocked relatives. "Crystal convinced me that Amber was having serious problems, and that we needed to create a crisis to get her help. She said it was like an intervention, that sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind. I never meant for it to go this far." The moment when Crystal's facade finally crumbled completely was when I pulled out our grandmother's letter and read it aloud to the entire family. As I shared Margaret's words about handmade gifts being the most valuable things in life, and her specific intention for me to inherit the fabric collection, several relatives began to understand the deeper significance of Crystal's Christmas attack. "You threw away a quilt made from Grandma's fabrics that she specifically intended for me," I said, looking directly at Crystal. "You didn't just attack my gift. You attacked everything our grandmother valued and everything she wanted our family to represent." Crystal's final desperate attempt to salvage the situation involved claiming that all of her actions had been motivated by genuine concern for Ruby's welfare, and that she was being unfairly persecuted for trying to help her family. But by this point, the evidence was so overwhelming and her lies so thoroughly exposed that even her most loyal supporters were stepping away from her. Bradford was arrested by federal agents the following Monday on charges related to embezzlement and financial fraud. Crystal was charged with elder abuse, filing false reports to government agencies, and conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. Veronica Sterling faced charges related to filing false affidavits and participating in a conspiracy to interfere with custody proceedings. The emergency custody petition was dismissed immediately once Derek's attorney reviewed the evidence showing that all of the allegations against me had been fabricated. Derek himself withdrew his custody request and apologized for being manipulated into participating in Crystal's scheme, without understanding the full scope of her deception. But the most satisfying victory was watching my parents finally understand the truth about which daughter had actually been devoted to family values, and which daughter had been exploiting their trust for personal gain. The reversal in their perspective was complete and immediate once they realized how thoroughly Crystal had manipulated them against their other daughter while literally stealing money from their medication fund. 6 months after the confrontation that destroyed Crystal's web of lies, I found myself sitting in the same spot where this story began, my living room, working on a quilt while Ruby played nearby. But everything about our lives had fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond simply exposing my sister's crimes. Crystal was serving an 18-month sentence in federal prison for elder abuse and conspiracy charges, while Bradford had received a 3-year sentence for embezzlement and financial fraud. Their marriage had been dissolved during the legal proceedings, with Crystal losing everything she had built her identity around: her wealth, her social status, her position as the family's golden child, and her freedom. The most profound change was in my relationship with my parents. The shock of discovering how thoroughly Crystal had manipulated them created a period of deep reflection about their treatment of both daughters over the years. They realized that their favoritism toward Crystal had been based on superficial measures of success: her wealth, her marriage, her social connections, while they had failed to appreciate my genuine character, my work ethic, and my devotion to family values. "I need to apologize to you for so many things," my mother told me during one of our weekly dinners that had become a new family tradition. We were so impressed by Crystal's lifestyle that we never stopped to question where that lifestyle was really coming from, or what kind of person she had become. "We failed to see that you were the daughter who was actually living the values we tried to teach you." My father's transformation was even more dramatic. He had begun helping me with home improvement projects, teaching Ruby woodworking skills, and taking genuine interest in our daily lives rather than just offering criticism about how we should be living differently. The man who had once dismissed my handmade gifts as evidence of my limitations was now proudly displaying the quilt I had made from our grandmother's fabrics in their living room. Ruby's recovery from the trauma of the custody battle had been remarkable to witness. Children are incredibly resilient when they feel safe and supported, and once the legal threats were eliminated, she bounced back to her normal cheerful self with surprising speed. But the experience had taught her important lessons about the difference between people who genuinely care about her welfare and people who might try to manipulate situations for their own benefit. The financial restitution from Crystal and Bradford's crimes had provided my parents with more than enough money to cover their medical expenses for years to come, while also creating a small college fund for Ruby that would ensure she would have opportunities one had never been able to provide on my own. Louise Chen had helped us establish legal protections that would prevent anyone from taking advantage of my parents' financial resources in the future. Perhaps most importantly, I had learned lessons about my own strength and capabilities that would serve me for the rest of my life. For years, I had accepted Crystal's narrative that I was the struggling sister who needed help and guidance. The experience of fighting back against her systematic attacks had revealed that I was actually much stronger, more resourceful, and more capable than anyone in my family had ever recognized. Garrett Thompson had become more than just a helpful neighbor. He had become a trusted friend and eventually something more meaningful. Our shared experience of uncovering Crystal's crimes had created a bond based on mutual respect and genuine care for each other's welfare. Ruby adored him, and he had become the positive male influence in her life that Derek had never been capable of providing. The most healing aspect of the entire experience was finally understanding our grandmother's wisdom about the value of handmade gifts. The quilt that Crystal had thrown in the trash had become a symbol of everything that was truly valuable about our family, the time and love invested in creating something beautiful, the preservation of family history and traditions, and the recognition that the most meaningful gifts come from the heart rather than the store. I had started teaching Ruby the quilting techniques our grandmother had taught me, and she was showing the same patience and creativity that had skipped a generation with Crystal. Watching her carefully stitch pieces of fabric together while listening to stories about her great-grandmother was evidence that the family traditions Crystal had tried to destroy would continue to thrive. The legal proceedings had also revealed that several other families in our community had been victims of similar manipulation campaigns by people who appeared trustworthy, but were actually predators. Our willingness to fight back and expose the truth had encouraged others to come forward with their own stories, ultimately leading to additional prosecutions and community awareness about these types of crimes. But beyond the legal victories and family reconciliation, the most important lesson I learned was about the nature of true self-worth. For years, I had allowed other people's opinions to define my value as a person, a mother, and a member of my family. The experience of fighting for my daughter and my reputation had taught me that my worth came from my own actions, my own character, and my own commitment to the people I loved. The Christmas morning when Crystal threw my gift in the trash had felt like the end of our family relationships. In reality, it was the beginning of authentic family relationships based on truth, respect, and genuine love rather than manipulation, favoritism, and superficial appearances. Sometimes the most painful experiences in life create opportunities for growth and healing that wouldn't be possible any other way. Today, as I put the finishing touches on a new quilt that will hang in Ruby's bedroom, I think about how grateful I am that Crystal's attack forced me to fight back and discover my own strength. The sister who tried to destroy my life actually gave me the opportunity to build a better life than I had ever thought possible. The quilt I'm working on now tells a different story than the one Crystal rejected. It's a story about resilience, justice, family healing, and the power of truth to triumph over even the most sophisticated lies. Every stitch represents a lesson learned, a relationship restored, or a moment of joy that came from surviving the storm Crystal created. I learned that my worth isn't determined by others' opinions of my gifts, but by the love and effort I put into them. The most beautiful things in life really do come from the hardest struggles, and sometimes the people who try to break us actually end up making us stronger than we ever knew we could be. What would you have done if you were in my situation? Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How do you think families should handle situations where one member is manipulating others? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing about your own experiences with family drama and justice. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to hear more incredible tales of family betrayal, sweet revenge, and ultimate triumph. Share this video with anyone who might be dealing with their own family manipulator. Sometimes knowing you're not alone is the first step toward fighting back. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey, and remember that no matter how dark things might seem, the truth always has a way of coming to light. Stay strong, stay true to your values, and never let anyone convince you that your handmade gifts aren't valuable enough.